All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. We're going to go ahead and get started here with our webinar for preparing for PCI DSS 4.0. Really appreciate everybody taking the time, setting aside the next 5 hours to cover PCI in depth. I'm just kidding. We're going to probably take the next 30 to 45 minutes to cover this topic and really hope that you guys find a lot of value in it. To jump in here real quickly and cover an agenda, we'll do introductions for myself and my cohort. We'll cover a little bit about CompliancePoint itself as a company. We're going to jump in then to PCI DSS 4.0. We'll then talk briefly about how we can help at a high level organizationally. And then towards the end, we're going to open it up for questions in a Q&A session to really dig into anything we didn't cover that you guys might want to dive into after we get through the presentation here. So I'm Greg Sparrow. I'm president here at CompliancePoint. My background, I really grew up in information security. I started out in PCI, really under the Visa CISP program, then transitioned into PCI during its inception. I've been a former QSA, former PA QSA, even have held the P2P certification and certified several different systems under that standard. So quite a bit of experience and really have been involved, again, in PCI since the inception and in a high level consulting under that even today.
Michael? My name is Michael Barnes, and I'm the senior security consultant. And like Greg, I have a background goes all the way back to the beginning of the PCI DSS back in 2006.
Yep.
And I came out of an IT consulting and administrative background, which happened after I got out of the service. I was in the United States Navy, held several high security clearances. So I was kind of been part of information security since I got out of high school.
Yeah. So a lot of experience for PCI on the call today, and hopefully you guys find this information valuable. To speak to CompliancePoint real quick. So as a company, our mission really is to enable trust with your customers and the marketplace. We do that really through focusing on risk. And we focus on risk in a couple of different areas. When you think about organizational risk, there's really risk with how you engage the marketplace and your customers. Once you have possession of that data, there's data stewardship requirements and risk with how you handle that information and process it internally. And then there's also downstream third-party risk within your vendor network. And as a company and organizationally, what we're really trying to address is risk mitigation in all three of those areas. We do that primarily with a focus on the areas of data security, data compliance, and data privacy. Our approach is really a full lifecycle engagement for our customers. That lifecycle at a high level is termed as identify, mitigate, and manage. And in essence, what we're trying to help organizations do is identify risks very early on, make sure they understand how that fits into their organizational priorities, help them then shift into mitigating those risks that have been identified, and more long-term, how do they manage that through various programs in a more ongoing basis. So making this part of your normal business operations. Our expertise really expands across multiple areas, that being both governance, operations, and technology. So if you think about that life cycle, we are looking at that enterprise stack across the life cycle. We can help you really in all three of these core areas. In fact, I would say this is one of the areas where we differentiate ourselves. We have a lot of strong technology backgrounds within our organization and can really help you understand what the right technology fit is to meet the compliance requirements or the risk that you're trying to address. In this case today, that would be PCI DSS, obviously. So our expertise is varied across multiple industry standards or industry segments themselves. We do quite a bit of work in the healthcare space, course, a lot of work within the payment card industry itself, but we also work in other areas. We do a lot of work in FISMA and NIST, so basically your federal standards, cloud compliance, a lot of SOC 2 work. I think the point is if it's got a 3-letter acronym around it, we pretty much have an expertise for it. Another piece of our business that we also speak on is data privacy. That primarily is driven around GDPR, really internationally, as well as things like CCPA here within the States. So at this point, I'm going to transition it over and hand it off to Michael, and he's going to cover what's new for PCI DSS 4.0.
Thank you, Greg. So speaking of PCI DSS 4.0, it is the first major revision in almost a decade.
Yep.
The last revision was a version 3.2.1 that came out back in 2018, and mostly all that was just getting rid of all of the future data requirements. The change from version 2 to 3 was so huge that it created all kinds of issues back then, 10 years ago. So there's a lot of concern about what's different in version 4 to justify a full version update. And so this one just came out in last March. And this is what we're going to talk about today. The 4.0 PDF is the comprehensive PCI Bible. And I say that because it is the go-to source of truth for PCI DSS. And it is now a 360-page document. The ROC template is 492, and I'm going to talk about that too. This document, 360 pages, is an explosion of the size of this document. The previous version 3.2.1 was only 139 pages. And the reason for that is they've really poured into this a lot of rich information to serve both the entity being assessed as well as the QSA, and understanding what is the intent of the requirement, what are the testing procedures, and a whole lot of other information I'm going to share in the next slide.
So Michael, if I'm hearing you, the report or the standard itself has expanded quite a bit, and I'm sure everyone on the call is quite interested in what that really means to them. What I'm hearing you say is that basically what that represents is the consolidation of intent and additional information and best practices to align with the controls, not necessarily an increase in complexity.
Correct. They wanted to remove a lot of ambiguity in the understanding of a lot of the controls. And so that's why this even more is such a valuable document. The previous version of this, the guidance column on the right that we'll talk about, was just a simple guidance. It was very valuable. But you're going to see next is that they've really added a lot more meat to it as well.
Yep.
One of the major changes in this version 4 is the reordering of controls. Most of us who have been with PCI for a long time have control numbers committed to memory. And one of the things we always remember is the last control of every major requirement was kind of a wrap-up requirement about policies and procedures being distributed and known to all. Well, they decided to make that a little bit more important and moved it to the very front. So it skewed the numbers for all of the controls. So generally, all we have to remember is that it's just one number off for the most part.
Yeah.
The other thing that is new about 4.0, and that is good, is that they've made this more generalized and more platform agnostic, meaning there's a recognition that there's a move to cloud environments and away from the traditional data center and server room environment and more virtualized systems.
I know that there's also been, I know for me, myself, I've had a lot of questions on the customized approach and what that really means for organizations. Can you tell me a little bit about, as a customer maybe who's been through PCI, I know the old version of the standard, what does the new customized approach really mean for me?
Yeah, this has created quite a bit of buzz because this is one of the biggest interesting additions to it. And I think the recognition is that our IT environment, our technology these days is changing so rapidly. We're coming up with new kinds of ways of doing things. And because of that, they recognize that sometimes a more advanced organization is going to come up with a way to solve a problem that doesn't quite meet the actual intent or detail of a control as
The letter,
written. Yeah. And so they said, okay, as part of this, recognizing that instead of coming up with a compensating control, they realize that, okay, this is a valid approach. You just need to define what that approach is and how it addresses the risk.
Sure.
And we're going to dive into that a little bit in a later slide.
Okay.
One of the things I noticed about the 4.0, just as a last bullet, is that to a QSA performing an assessment, this format and the controls is really ensuring that a QSA is doing a thorough assessment and how we are to describe the findings of an in-place control. And so that I found that very interesting. I mentioned that the ROC template is now 492 pages blank, whereas the 3.2 one was just under 200 pages. That's not because there's an expansion of number of controls. It's just the way they laid it out. And I'm going to show you that.
So, Michael, I know you've talked about a lot of the changes at a high level here with the new version of the standard. As a customer with a QSA walking in the door, what are some of the things I should do to help prepare myself to enable an assessment under this new version?
Certainly. It is a daunting size document, but the first thing I'm going to recommend is make sure you have a copy of this at hand at all times. Use it like your primary reference tool. It is hyperlinked in the table of contents, so it's easy to navigate even with a PDF reader.
Mm-hmm.
But be familiar with it so you know how to get around to it, because there's going to be lots of questions on how to implement and what the intent is. And to know this document is very important, because if you come to me as your QSA, this is the first place I'm going to go.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So there's a lot of busyness on this slide, and I have no intention of reading everything that's on this slide. This is just an example, and this is actually included in the document to give you a roadmap to what is in this data security standard Bible. And you can see all around there's the defined approach as we normally see, and the defined testing procedures as we usually see. But in the far right column in the guidance, there's a whole lot more there than just what was the purpose or the background. You can see, maybe you can see it or not. There's also good practice definitions, some examples perhaps, and further information. Also, as part of this is every control can be satisfied with a customized approach. So for that reason, they actually added a customized approach objective for every single control. And so this kind of gives you the high level intent. Sometimes this is what was missing in past versions of this, is what was the intent? And we almost had to surmise what the intent was.
Sure.
Here they kind of put it in black and white. So this is what it is. If you're going to use the defined approach, here's the testing procedures. If you're going to use a customized approach, here's what your objective is. And then also with every control, they've added this applicability notes, which needs to be seriously considered for every control. It's going to give you a little bit more background about what's intended and what's needed.
Sure. Yeah, one thing I would also recommend folks look at, if you look at the center column there with the testing procedures, there is some very specific language around examine documents, examine configurations, observe procedures or processes, interview personnel. I think those are all very key trigger words from the standpoint that as a client, think about what you might need to provide to satisfy those testing procedures. If you understand what the QSA is looking for ahead of time, you can go ahead and prepare a lot of this stuff. It's going to make that assessment process go much easier.
Well said. So this slide is a snapshot of the example requirement. This is also in the beginning where they present what is in this. And basically, because of the expansion of this table, there's generally one requirement per page. And that's why it exploded to 490 some odd pages. So the majority of this probably will never be used. If you focus on the very center, it says validation method for a customized approach. My guess is that a customized approach is going to be pretty rare. So that's almost always going to be checked no and a not applicable statement for response. Same thing with the second part. It's indicating whether a compensating control was used for this. Again, probably pretty rare. That's going to be checked no and not applicable. And that kind of takes care of almost a third of the real estate of every page of every control. So that explains the explosion of the size. So not to be worried about that.
What about checkbox in the statuses, right, for the
Hmm.
assessment findings themselves? How are
Yeah,
those different for this version of the standard?
I am glad you pointed that out because there's something very odd here that many of you probably already know. This is the snapshot of the current version that is released. And we are all familiar with in place. We're also familiar with not applicable, not tested, and not in place. What's noticeably absent here is the in place with compensating controls and replaced with an option for in place with remediation. Now, that in place with remediation isn't functionally intended to be a replacement of compensating controls, and I'll explain why. They put compensating controls down in that section of the bottom third of it where it says validation method defined approach, compensating control. So that just kind of moved down there with a little bit more explanation. Then they inserted this in place with remediation, and there was a lot of hype and talk about what was the intention of this. And because many organizations sometimes miss things that are supposed to happen on a routine basis throughout the year, then they'd get finding as not in place because they didn't get a quarterly scan done.
Hmm.
They didn't do something they were supposed to do. They didn't do the firewall review. And
Hmm.
now it's too late. You can't go back in time to fix that. But they did fix it during the assessment. So it's now in place with remediation.
Yeah.
And that was the intent of this checkbox. So we were all excited about that. However, they took it out. It's not going to be there. They're reissuing the entire data security standard, and it's supposed to be out by the end of this month, lacking that checkbox. There's only going to be 4 checkboxes across. What they're telling us is that there's going to be a new appendix to deal with those kinds of situations because they were afraid that that was going to be abused.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's one of the, when you zoom out and look at this from an industry perspective, I think one of the challenges with PCI is that it can be very binary in nature in the findings. And I think the effort in the new version of the standard is to provide more transparency, still allowing clients or the assessee to meet the intent of the control requirement, but also giving disclosures more accurately when there was remediation required or what the particular state of that environment looks like. Disclosing that in the report and then allowing those that are consuming the report to make the risk-based decisions that they want to make based off of that information.
Right.
So the goal being really more transparency overall.
Absolutely. There's always been a fear of having any requirement marked as not in place
Yeah, 100%.
because they think that that's an overall failure.
Yep.
But the entities that organizations report to, whether it be a merchant reporting to their processor or a service provider reporting to the brands, they want to know what's really going on.
Mm.
And they want to know if there were findings. And they're not going to shut you down because you had a couple of findings. So they're going to say, all right, this needs to be remediated. What's the timeline for that remediation?
What are your corrective actions? How do you plan to
Right.
address it? What timeline?
And that's what the
gonna occur
AOC
on? Yep.
addresses, right? So if there were findings, what is the remediation time frame?
Yep.
So some of the notable changes about the report on compliance template, I addressed some of these. The very beginning of it, we used to frequently refer to as the executive summary, and then they changed it to the assessment overview or executive overview. They've now just called it's the assessment overview. The misconception was if it's an executive summary, then it's just a summary of the rest of it,
Sure.
where it's really not. It's really the front matter, the content, the meat of what makes up what this assessment is going to be. So in going through the new version of this, one of the things that jumped out at me right away was this section called an attestation signature. In the past, the only place where there was a signature was generally the attestation of compliance. And that was usually a senior executive within the organization. Commonly, as we do, the lead QSA is signing that with the acknowledgement of our senior executive personnel. But now that's going right into the ROC itself. There is a section now where the lead QSA needs to affix a time and date and a digital signature to that report on compliance. And I believe the intent of this here is to really give QSAs pause, that they are doing a serious job here, serious work, and they're attesting to the accuracy of this report. And it's always been a very humbling thing to know. In the past, where we had in the requirement 12, for instance, for like 20 different places where it says, what is the name of the assessor who validates X, Y, and Z? And you're putting your name in there 20 times, it gives you a pause.
And just to be clear, that signature is for the QSA themselves, not necessarily a signature from the customer side.
No, it is not a signature from the customer side. This is an attestation basically by the lead QSA. So not even an executive of the company. Who was the lead QSA? And provide the signature.
Okay.
They're really emphasizing accountability. One of the last parts of the assessment overview in the past had always been Section 5, and we're all familiar with the ASB scan reports. They actually want to know the dates of the scans and whether they're passed or failed or need rescans. What was surprising to me is that they also added to that section, or the equivalent to that section, internal vulnerability scans. Obviously, they're recognizing that this is more critical and more important than organizations have placed on it. Sometimes they don't put the same level of emphasis and importance on remediating critical and high findings on internal, because the assumption is, well, it's just internal. It's not visible to the internet. So we'll put that on the back burner until we take care of other things. Now they want to know, when was a quarterly scan for the internal? Was it passing? Was there rescan after remediation? They want that right up in front.
This is another area where I think, with the focus on the internal side being put up into the executive summary section, essentially, of the report, it really is putting focus on maintaining that program. So a lot of customers, they make a big effort to achieve certification. They don't think about how they're maintaining this certification over time. These types of recurring processes are very important, particularly when you come around for like year 2, right? The fact that you've got to not only now have this process in place, but it's got to be reported on. And if you miss on one, that is a very painful piece that's now going to be noted in the very top of the report.
True. My next bullet is talking about the focus on improving assessor narratives. If you ever studied a full report on compliance and all the testing findings performed by the QSA, there was a lot of sections where there was a lot of redundancies in what the findings were. Mm-hmm. And one of the structures changes in the controls that I could have pointed out in the previous slide was that they brought all that to the top. So right under the checkboxes, if it's in place, that's where the narrative goes for that entire control. And all the testing procedures below are primarily, I would say 95% of the time, straight references to what's the document, what's the sample set, who was interviewed. They're just simple or yes, no checkboxes. There's no narrative context, except in the very top where the assessor says, why were they found to be in place? Mm-hmm. The in place with remediation. So I just discussed this earlier. So that's going away, except they're going to address it by the use of a potential appendix for situations where we thought that, for instance, missed ASB scans could just be put in place remediation as long as they had a current ASB. I'm not even sure how that's going to look. They haven't told us. The definition of objectives for customized approach, I kind of touched on this already before, and that's kind of a very simple, what was the intent of this requirement? And that's really the definition of objectives. And then the applicability notes. As I said, these are with every requirement, and they told us through training, says, make sure that you fully understand and consider everything that's in the applicability notes. We put them there for a reason. So this is a new element to the controls. So some notable changes to controls. Now, these are changes to controls, not new controls that I'm addressing here. One of the first ones that jumped out at me was finally the removal of the minimum 7-character password length, because passwords of 7 characters are fairly easy to crack these days. So they went along with the NIST new guidance regarding password length and went to 12 characters as a minimum. Now, along with that and following the NIST guidance is if you have a long passphrase, the requirement for frequent change of passwords every 90 days, for instance, is better because people will not be writing them down and doing insecure things with recording their passwords. So PCI took that and also said multi-factor authentication is also required for all CD access or non-console access to the CDE. Part of this also, because they realize that they're removing that change and increasing the password, the likelihood of fat fingering passwords is going to be increased.
Mm-hmm.
So mercilessly, they increased the number of lockout attempts from 6 to 10. So we used to always remember these 90 days, 6 days, 30-minute lockouts, those kinds of things. So these are some of the things that have changed. The only time the 90-day password is still in place is where you can't implement multi-factor authentication. Then you still have to have a 90-day change.
So in essence, if you wrap your authentication with multi-factor, you can drop your password aging and as well as increase the lockout attempt. So basically making it easier for a user, one, to remember their password, and giving them more attempts to type in a longer password, basically making it more user friendly.
Correct. Okay. Another big change is they've removed or kind of consolidated the old 6.5.1 through 6.5.10 testing procedures, which historically had followed the OWASP top 10. And as OWASP evolved faster than changes to the data security standard, those kind of drifted away. So what they have done is they've removed that. And
so no more web app testing?
No, there's still web application testing, but the interview process of challenging developers on how well they knew how to protect against poor coding for cross-site scripting, for instance. So we don't spend a whole lot of time testing them on their knowledge of secure coding practices.
Mm-hmm.
So what they also did anecdotally as to compensate for that is part of 6.6 was one of the options was to have a web application firewall. Now they've moved that to 6.2, and a web application firewall is basically required for any web application, internet-facing web application. So that's how they kind of solved that problem. The fourth item that I pointed out is a targeted risk analysis. Traditionally, this has been an annual risk assessment that has been required, and often a risk assessment across an entire organization sometimes misses the goal of the PCI risks that need to be dealt with. So recognizing that, the council wanted to address some of the frequency controls where the client has the ability to determine how frequent something should happen.
Mm-hmm.
Is it something that needs to happen daily, weekly, or monthly, or even annually? If you have the ability to determine we're only going to do that on a monthly basis, then your targeted risk analysis document must address your rationale for that frequency selection.
So you can't simply pull those frequencies out of thin air. You must have some risk-based approach to justify those
justification.
decisions.
Yeah, and anecdotally, gas stations. Requirement 9.9 to evaluate those point of sale systems for tampering, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of gas stations are checking that every day.
Mm-hmm.
So it's part of their policy to check it every day.
Yeah.
But in stores, they're being monitored all the time. Doors are locked when they're closed. There's cameras on it. Maybe monthly is suitable.
Sure. Yeah. So really based on the risk environment in which they operate.
Correct. So what about the new controls? There are, by the count in their document covering the changes, 64 new controls in total. 53 of them apply to all entities, and there's 11 new controls that are specific for service providers. But we're not going to get down to that nitty gritty because that would be a 2-hour webinar all by itself.
Actually, would be a 5-hour webinar.
Correct. Probably so. Suffice it to say that 13 are immediately required. And 10 of those are related to what I referred to earlier when they moved the policy and procedure review to the first test. What they added to that was documenting roles and responsibilities for each of those requirements.
Mhm.
And those are required immediately. They need to document roles and responsibilities for each of those requirements. And it occurs 10 times. I don't know why it doesn't occur 12 times, but it only occurs 10 times because there are 12 requirements.
Yeah. Okay, so you've covered the first 10 of those with policy procedure requirements, essentially, and roles definition. The last three, I'm sure everybody on the call wants to know, for the new version of the standard, what are the other three immediate requirements that they must address?
Right. So we talked about the targeted risk analysis, and that's one of them. It's referenced in requirement 12. So it kind of replaces that risk analysis procedure.
The enterprise risk assessment.
The enterprise risk assessment. It is now a risk analysis, targeted risk analysis. That is required immediately as well. And then the 12th one would be to document and verify the scope annually. So this is an exercise that needs to happen well before beginning your annual assessment.
Yeah.
So your QSA, if he's doing a reassessment, he's going to want to see where's your documentation of evaluating your scope, particularly if you've reduced scope from the footprint of your entire organization.
So really something that was, I think, originally an implicit requirement is now an explicit one.
Right. There must be an exercise in your documentation that you've reevaluated. Is your scope still what you have always claimed it to be? Because we always come across issues of scope creep, where you've added a new service, added a new process, and now your scope is different from last year. And the last one that's required immediately is really for third-party service providers. We're all familiar with requiring getting a recent AOC from a third-party service provider to validate their compliance. But that third-party service provider now is also required to document which requirements they're satisfying on your behalf. Now, normally we've always requested some responsibilities matrix to cover this. Now they're codifying it in the requirements that they must provide a list of controls that they are satisfying on behalf of their customers or clients.
Yep. And then I guess beyond that, there's 51 additional controls that would come into play basically in 2025. So essentially, after you've certified to the new version of the standard, you've got the initial 13 to deal with, and then 51 that would kick in the year after
right.
that.
Yeah. And they really run the gamut. Things like just addressing how sensitive authentication data is stored encrypted. So a lot of nuances for new ones, but there's so many different areas that it would just take too long for us to go through all of them in a webinar of this format. So how does this apply? I've been talking about how this is going to affect QSACs. And that's because of the significant changes to the reporting template. A lot of organizations have tooled specifically to the 3.2 format. So it's going to affect us QSACs quite a bit, both from that standpoint and just being familiar with it. We don't know how much effect this is going to be to changes in potential pricing. My first view of it, as I mentioned, that now that we have the narrative at the top of each control, rather than having a lot of redundant narratives, that this might simplify things and shorten some of the processes when it comes to interviewing and completing a report on compliance. But obviously the biggest way this applies to merchants are the 53 new controls that we just covered and 11 new service provider specific controls. So service providers are looking at a total of 64 total controls. And most of those aren't required until 2025. So required immediately for both merchants and service providers, as we talked about the roles and responsibilities for all the requirements, or 10 out of the 12 anyway. A targeted risk analysis that we just discussed to address controls with ambiguous or periodic type requirements. The annual documentation of scope, I think that's a big thing to everyone should be aware of and think about doing. And the third-party service providers to provide compliance status and a matrix of responsibilities.
MRO, that's a term that some of you guys might not be familiar with.
All right, scope considerations and changes. So I get asked this question by organizations that are concerned about the new control, the new standard affecting what might be in scope. To the best of my judgment in reviewing all of this, the new controls or change controls should not affect your scope of your PCI DSS compliance requirement
as it stands today.
as it stands today. Not performing the scoping exercise is probably the biggest reason for assessments extending long beyond the time period you anticipate. Generally, we target a 90-day process. That's what the council has always recommended, that assessment should not go beyond 90 days because your evidence becomes stale. Usually it gets prolonged because the scope had not been well established or defined. And there's always constant readjustment, which means you have to go back and get different sample sets. You got to go interview somebody else. You got to go visit a different site. So documenting that scope is critical.
Yeah, and I think also revalidating that in year 2, right? I think a lot of people aren't prepared for that exercise. That is the responsibility of the customer, not the QSA. The QSA validates that scope in accordance with PCI DSS, and that is something that does oftentimes cause delays in an assessment.
Correct. So once again, I don't really see a change in the scope for a new an entity based on these new controls.
So good news under 4.0 on that one.
So back to the customized approach for controls. The intent here is really for much more mature organizations doing a lot more advanced bleeding edge technologies that may have come up with a clever way of accomplishing a target that just does not meet the way a control is written. The only example that comes to mind right off the top of my head is something like passwords, right? The industry as a whole hates passwords, and they become more complex because we use passwords for everything.
For authentication
everywhere.
in a broader
For authentication,
sense.
yes.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to start seeing a lot of creative ways of not having to have a password at all. And I don't know how it's going to look. I've seen things like a product called Squirrel, which will change the way remote authentication happens across the web, that doesn't use passwords. So in situations like that, how do you address those requirement 8 controls, talking about password length and frequency of change? You're not doing that. So you have to come up with a customized approach.
So not meeting the letter of the control, but still mitigating risk or maybe meeting the intent, right? How often do you see most of the folks on this call as a standard organization that's just looking to get by with a PCI certification? Do you think they're going to apply this customized approach?
I really think it's going to be extremely rare.
Yeah.
Because the rigor that has to go into this effort is going to be daunting. It's going to be, as I said, a more advanced, mature type of organization that has really come up with a creative way to solve a big problem. So just to give you an idea, it's not a way to get away or around complying with certain controls. It doesn't replace compensating controls. In fact, you can't use a compensating control for meeting your customized approach because your customized approach is obviously something that is designed by the organization. And that's where the rigor comes in from the organization, is you have to design what those controls are and demonstrate how they meet the intent of the original requirement. The other big heavy lift here is you're going to have to work with your QSA, because the QSA has to fully understand what that customized approach is and then derive testing procedures to validate that the customized approach is effective in meeting the intent of the requirement. Yeah. So there's a lot of work on the front end. I would even recommend that on the sales side that we ask that first. Yeah. Do you anticipate using any customized approach controls? Because we probably need to have a conversation about that before we understand what's going to be involved in the assessment.
So increased flexibility overall, but also increased work effort from the customer side as well as the QSA.
Correct. So we're coming up to the end of the slides here, and this is a timetable that probably everybody is familiar with. We've been saying this since the beginning of 2021 when they announced the new version 4.0 coming out, and we are currently obviously in Q4 2022. We have 2023 coming up, And the 321 is retired on March 31st in 2024. So we have the option of continuing to assess under 321 throughout the next calendar year and into the following year. And just anecdotally, if you have begun a 321 assessment and it doesn't get completed by March 31st, 2024, it doesn't mean you have to stop and reassess under
As long as the
4.0.
assessment has started.
As long as it was started under during this time frame of transition. But we don't want people waiting to review what these changes are really going to mean, because as we pointed out, most of these new controls are future dated for the end of Q1 in 2025. But as we learned from previous revisions where new controls were added in 3.2, that many organizations were getting away, saying, oh, well, that's not for 2 years. Oh, that's not for a year and a half. Oh, we'll worry about that next year. And then they get up to their reassessment and say, we've been so busy, we haven't even looked at it. And now they're in trouble.
Yep.
So we want to help and make sure that we don't do that. So we want to look at this timeline and provide some suggestions on how we can help look at those changes and begin doing an assessment or a bridge assessment. And we'll talk about some kind of gap analysis to help you prepare for version 4.
So really customers need to look at the next 4 to 5 quarters as a transition period to the new standard. During that time, they can certify under either version of the standard, but they should be looking at preparing for 4.0 if they're not certifying under that version.
Correct. So as we say here, regardless of your environment type, we are recommending that you can continue with the 3.2.1 assessment unless you have a compelling reason to want to start on 4.0. For instance, maybe taking advantage of the customized approach, or maybe some of the new controls, you're already ready for it. You've reviewed it. You said, we're ready. Let's jump in and do it.
Or even a third-party requirement, right? I think there are times where someone might require a 4.0 attestation for one reason or another.
True. So what are the different types of assessments we're considering? If your assessment time frame is the beginning of 2023, for instance, you might want to consider waiting until you complete that assessment before you do some kind of a gap analysis, depending on the size and how complex your environment and assessment process is. But if you have the bandwidth and your QSA has got the knowledge, it's a good opportunity to say, hey, we're at this requirement. By the way, this one changes in 4.0.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a look at what that's really going to do to you.
Mm-hmm.
Is this going to be a problem for next year? So you're kind of doing a parallel review with your assessor while you're undergoing it. We're coming up with a bridge assessment, which is going to be a simple, fairly simple report that we can provide to you in parallel while you're doing that assessment under 3.2.1, or perform after you're completed with it. And that will really just focus on the changes, the delta between 3.2.1 and 4.0. So we're not doing a rigorous gap assessment from top to bottom. We're just going to say, what are the differences with these controls? By having your QSA involved at that time, he or she is already familiar with your environment and what the implications of those changes might be.
It's essentially the deltas between the old version versus the new version.
Right. As opposed to waiting to some other time where you may have a QSA who's not familiar with your environment, and they have to spend a little bit more time really fully understanding your architecture and your environment, reviewing your previous assessments. But when it's done in parallel, your QSA is already familiar with your environment and the impact of the changes.
Yep.
If you haven't gone through a 3.2.1 assessment, for instance, or maybe this is your first year, or you're jumping into PCI for the very first time under 4.0, we really recommend doing a full gap assessment. And this is more of a full, rigorous, top to bottom assessment, including looking at sample evidence. Maybe it's not as rigorous evidence. Show me one of these. Mm-hmm. Show me that you're doing this in a compliant manner, and just say, keep doing it that way, so that when you pull evidence for the assessment, they all look the same.
I would also recommend customers who are looking at transitioning QSAs to consider a full-fledged gap assessment, right? I think, like it or not, there are different interpretations in the industry across QSAs. As much as we try and minimize that, that is the reality. And I think looking at having a readiness or a gap assessment done with that new QSA company and a new QSA is a critical part so that you are aligned with interpretation, control expectations, documentation requirements. All of those things are aligned as you go into a formal assessment cycle.
I fully concur.
All right. So, just to wrap things up here, talk very briefly about how we can help you guys. Again, to jump back to our life cycle, it's risk identification, risk mitigation, and risk management. What does that really mean in the context of PCI or on assessments? So, from an identification standpoint, we can come in at a very early stage and help you with strategic consulting. We can help document data flows and define potential scope and the impact of that scope for the organization. And as we've already talked about, we can perform various levels of readiness assessments depending on what your needs are as an organization. From a risk mitigation standpoint, once we've identified gaps or deficiencies with the environment, we can really come in and help you solve or implement appropriate controls, frameworks at all layers of the organizations to mitigate that risk. That covers, again, that entire layer of governance, operations, and technology. So the complete enterprise stack there. And then, of course, we can come in and do formal assessments, not just for PCI. So depending on what your needs are, we can either assess against PCI or even pair those up with multiple assessments and provide some synergies from that aspect. From a long-term management standpoint, I think organizationally, this is one of the areas where we set ourselves apart most from the competition. We really pride ourselves on our ongoing recurring business where we provide compliance and security orchestration services for our customers. So really looking at that period of time where you've already achieved certification, you're looking at how do you manage and maintain those programs long term. We really specialize in helping companies manage that part of the program, right? So maintaining your posture, maintaining your compliance status, and operationalizing those components on the business. In essence, we take ownership of the pieces with compliance that are hard, and we allow you guys to focus on your business and what you're good at. We also do that oftentimes in combination or conjunction with some type of GRC or technology solutioning, helping you to automate those controls and provide the appropriate level of management visibility. And then more long term, we can help you roadmap and improve your processes overall. So looking at continuous process improvement and risk reduction over time. All right, everybody. So that really wraps up the formal presentation and the items we wanted to cover. At this point, we'll shift gears into the Q&A portion of the presentation. Happy to dig in and answer any questions you guys have. If you'll just post those to the chat, we'll work through those as we get them and try and answer as much as we can.
Just to clarify, we recorded this last week, and many of you may already know that the council has already released, as of yesterday, the update regarding the in place with remediation. So that is now in place. We're not going to be seeing that in the future. So we'll go to the questions now.
Yeah, thanks for that update, Michael. To jump into the questions here at this point, looks like we do have a couple that are pretty popular here in the group. I appreciate everybody's engagement on those. So I'll just cover the ones as they've been voted. So the first one here is, does MFA, multi-factor authentication, apply to remote desktop connections within the local network? So Michael, what do you think?
Well, one of the things you often hear a QSA say, and sometimes it's ad nauseum, it depends. You know, we really need to take a look at the architecture of how you've implemented jump boxes and other connections into that environment. There's so many ways to do it. So suffice it to say is we need to ensure that multi-factor is applied to access the CDE particularly, and any non-console access. So when you're talking about if you're connecting to, let's say, a jump box that's inside the CDE, then probably the multi-factor jumping from that to other systems within that network is probably not going to be a requirement.
Yep. Yeah, I think the key parts there from my mind are really, is it remote access, right? Are you reaching into the CDE, and are you gaining administrative level access, right? If you're asking yes to those questions, you likely require multi-factor.
Correct.
Okay, so next
What we
question. Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
No, I was good. And anecdotally, I was just going to say that's why a QSA sometimes wants to observe and watch administrators, particularly access that environment, starting from their desktop, watching them connect, make that VPN connection, watching where they multi-factor, and then watching at what point they make that remote desktop connection.
Yep, good point. Next question here. With the removal of the 90-day password age, does that mean there is no longer a password expiration for those who access the CDE?
Uh, well, no. Uh, if you cannot, I believe it's stated in such a way that if you can't implement multi-factor authentication, then the access to the CDE will still need to be 12 characters and 90-day password minimum age or maximum age.
Right. So this is a common one that comes up I think this is an acronym that gets thrown around a lot in the industry, but is zero trust segmentation good for PCI?
The way it's stated, my knee-jerk reaction is, why wouldn't it be?
Yeah.
Um, if it's something that's needing to be removed from scope, then yes, we want to make sure that there is actually no connectivity into the CDE from that network environment. So a zero trust segmentation is probably a good way to approach it.
Yeah, I would say maybe, PCI was the original zero trust in some ways. It's not an explicit requirement of the standard, but I think the more that you can segment, the better off you are as far as defining the scope of the CDE. And that certainly helps with everything from overall management of the environment, from the security controls, as well as even assessing it. So the more you can segment, the better.
And to be clear, there's a distinction between general segmentation and the use of segmentation for the purpose of reducing scope, right? So that's what you need to be thinking about.
Segmentation with access control for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the next question, it looks like we've got another one. By increasing the failed login attempts from 6 to 10, is that not giving? Is that not going to give someone with malicious intent accessing someone's account more easily?
Well, the probability that they're going to get 10 attempts without triggering some kind of notification is unlikely, but also keep in mind that if multi-factor authentication is being implemented, um, they're still going to have to get through that second factor authentication for the most part. If you're talking about situations where uh, multi-factor has not been implemented and it's just 12 characters and uh, a 90-day, uh, that's still a pretty high bar for a person with malicious intent.
Yeah, exactly. I think the key
So
part there is multi-factor. All right, next question up here is what is your recommendation for your customers regarding PCI 4.0 for next year?
we went through it, that last slide of mine is, unless you have a compelling need to want to go to 4.0, such as you're going to implement some kind of customized approach, or you believe that you're ready to go ahead and do that, or uh, you're new to PCI and you're going to be validating for the first time, I'm not sure it would make sense for that person to do a 3-2-1 and then have to go through uh, uh, a gap analysis or a bridge assessment um, to then make a change and leap up to 4.0 in just under a year. So if you're currently doing a 3-2-1, you're going to be doing an assessment at the beginning of the year. I would continue doing a 3-2-1 and do some kind of evaluation, gap analysis, bridge assessment kind of a thing in parallel or shortly following thereafter, preferably with the same QSA, as I said before, because he's going to be most familiar with your environment.
Yeah, I think I agree, Michael. I think for most of our customers, we're basically saying assessment of the current version that you're already on for next year, and probably look at a bridge assessment, right? So if there's any
Correct.
changes to the environment, especially major changes, consider doing that. And then, like I said in the presentation earlier, if you're looking at a more significant change, maybe who's even assessing you from a QSA standpoint, certainly looking at a more full blown gap assessment is recommended under 4.0 for next year. I mean, I think that would be worth everyone's time as you go through a transition like that. So the next question here, is there a what's new for 4.0 type of guide? There is actually, and I believe that's actually been a link to that's been posted in chat. So we'll let you guys just take a look at that link from there. So next question here, how do you meet, assess, and manage a new client? What ongoing help do you get so it doesn't ever reach remediation during the year? I think that's a good question. So I think our approach really, when you talk about engaging overall from a customer standpoint, what we're trying to do is look at how do we implement a program or an assessment cycle that makes the most sense for the organization, that minimizes the impact to daily operations. We can do that in a couple of different ways. We have our traditional assessment cycle. So if you're a pretty mature organization, we can just come in, knock out an assessment during a certain time window in the year that we all agree upon. You provide all of the evidence during that window. We write up the report and issue our findings from there. So that's probably the standard approach that's been in the industry for a long time, right? The other approach from a program, an ongoing orchestration perspective that we talked about earlier, is really about us helping you identify what recurring procedures must happen when, making sure that we've got the right technology in place, maybe a GRC solution that helps you document evidence as you go throughout the year, providing some type of automation. So maybe technical configuration audits of the environment, really streamlining how we get information out of that technical layer. And then consolidating that throughout the year as we go, so that when you actually get to a reporting period, it's really more about us writing the report, as opposed to try and go back and collect all this evidence and avoiding things like missing the internal quarterly scan, like we talked about earlier. So really, I think it's about orchestrating and coordinating with the customer, looking at a clear calendar of events that must occur, and everybody agreeing on where that evidence is stored from a repository standpoint. That's normally how we like to approach those from an ongoing orchestration standpoint. Lots of questions here. Good stuff. Next question here. How does this affect our costs for certification? So I guess I'll cover this one as well. Certainly there is additional work effort with a larger reporting format. As we've talked about, we're trying to handle that by implementing smart programs, incorporating technology into our process to minimize the work effort as much as we can on both our side as well as yours. I think that's certainly a point of consideration as you evaluate QSAs, to look at their maturity level and how they engage you. I do think that there is potentially more work effort and more costs being driven by that. So I think that's definitely something to be mindful of as you go forward. Next question here. Are all organizations forced to move to 4.0? So Michael, you want to cover that one?
Well, the short answer is yes. The 321 sunsets March 25, March 31, 2024. Yeah, I get dates confused because the other deadline date is the future dated requirements, which is March 31st, 2025. So yes, unless you start a 321 before March 31, 2024, you will be required to validate under 4.0.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, everybody has to move to it, but you do have quite an overlap or a window to make that transition, basically about a year and a half. Next one here is a web application firewall going to be a requirement? And if so, when?
Yeah, it's one of the requirements that has changed, but also has a future date component to it. 6.6 was an option between a manual review versus a web application firewall. They've moved that to 641. See, I'm already committing these stupid things to memory. Where it's an option. So you can either do the manual review or a web application firewall, but in March 31, 2025, the future date, that goes away and 6.2 kicks in, where a web application firewall will be required for any internet facing web applications handling cardholder data.
Yeah. So we've got quite a few other questions here, and I know we are running up against time. I'm going to try and wrap this up here. And if we don't get to your question specifically, we will try and reach out to you directly and respond to that. Let me look. So we've really already covered some of these. So for timing again, if we do the assessment in Q1 under 321, and it's required by March 2024, does that mean our Q1 2024 assessment must be in 4.0, or is the requirement still not until 2025?
Well, again, if you start a 321 before it sunsets, you can complete it. You don't have to go back and then reassess under 4.0. You can complete the 321 even if you don't complete it before the sunset date. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's all about when you start. I mean, that's really the key point there. And then we do have a question basically about false positives on vulnerability scans. I do think this is one that comes up quite a bit. Essentially, how do you deal with false alarms in those scans? So, Michael, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. You really need to have a good relationship with your ASV. These things come up frequently, and they need to look at it and determine whether it is truly a false positive. They will document it and reissue the report if necessary. Your QSA should be looking closely at that too, because sometimes uh, it can affect what systems you're looking at as far as the internet facing application. So this is going to be, for instance, I'm thinking of an instance where the ASV deemed it as a false positive at the request of the customer, but the pen tester was repeatedly finding it and exploiting it. And so I questioned the veracity of the ASV decision to mark something as a false positive.
Yeah. And then it looks like we've also got a question from Paul in chat around our compliance orchestration service. Would you expect guidance around the shifting controls? The short answer to that is yes, you should, and we're typically providing those as part of the out brief from a ROC assessment, or if there's some other note or desire to do that ahead of time, that is where a bridge assessment would be something we would recommend from a service standpoint. So I think we've really covered most of the questions at this point. I just really want to take a minute and say thank you to everybody that's held on the call today. We certainly appreciate the time and hope that this information was valuable to you guys. Again, if you'd go back and fill out the survey, we would definitely appreciate that as well. But at this point, I think we're going to wrap up, and thank you all for joining today.